Hello, everyone, and welcome to Nerding Out on Neurodiversity, the podcast for all things neurodivergence. I'm Dr. Matt Zakreski, clinical psychologist and professional speaker, and I'm happy to be your host through the wild trails of the neurodivergent world.
And I'm Jake Noonan, educational coach and humanities teacher, your co-host and producer, and I'm thrilled to help share the stories and the experiences of wonderful people in the world of neurodiversity.
We're really excited for today's guest, which we are going to say a lot because we're always really excited about every guest we get. So let's get into it. Welcome to Nerding Out on Neurodiversity. Our guest today is Charles Kransberger, an amazing job coach and therapist within the neurodivergence community. Charles, thank you so much for being here with us today, my friend.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate the introduction, Jake and Dr. Matt.
So I know a lot about you. Jake knows a lot about you, but our listeners do not. So Charles, give us the background. What's your origin story?
Sure. Yeah, let me just give you the long version, and then we can just tease out whatever you want to tease out from there. So I'm originally from a small town called Edgerton, Wisconsin. The nickname was Tobacco City. We had one stoplight, probably more cows than people. That was the vibe, right? Pretty classical Midwestern town. So in this small town, my mother worked in my school district, school of just a couple hundred kids, and she was a special education paraprofessional. So I remember as early on as like being 8 or 10 years old, being in a classroom, and she's like in the row of desks next to me or the table in the other side of the room, paired up one-on-one with one of my classmates. So I'm just wondering at myself at an early age, like, why is my mom coming to school and hanging out with another one of my classmates all day long? Like, what is the nature of their relationship? How did this matchmaking occur? Like, what's the deal, right? Just trying to figure that out. And she, before I had any notion of disability or neurodiversity or anything like that, was introducing me to my classmates who were autistic or had Down syndrome, or whatever the case may be, who she was working with, and saying, oh, he loves the Green Bay Packers too. He loves Pokemon too. So we had this common ground that was the foundation of a relationship. And we became friends and got to know these folks pretty well, like just kind of across childhood. You get to that point where it's like junior, senior year, and everybody starts talking about where I'm going to college, what I'm going to be with when I grow up, what's next. I saw these folks getting left behind, and I wanted to explore that a little bit further. So, but I think it was between my junior and senior year of high school, I worked for our summer school special education program. And we had a week that had a vocational emphasis. It was like different outings that to help prepare these folks for launching into that career portion of their lives. And one of the outings that we went to, in hindsight, as I reflect upon it now, was at a sheltered workshop. So it was a situation where it's just folks with disabilities who work there. They're getting paid a couple cents for every little widget that they put together. So it might be like $1 or $2 an hour. And it really gave me the EBGBs. Like, it felt fundamentally disrespectful. And it felt like these folks who I've known my whole life, and I know what they're capable of and know what they're interested in, this isn't it, right? So I was like, all right, let's pursue a career working with these folks, hopefully getting them on a different track, more consistent with their interests and capabilities. So my only concept of that at the time was to go be a special education teacher myself. So that's what I did. Went and declared at the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire in northern Wisconsin as a special education major, and was working part-time, working with some different clients, doing like supportive home care, things like this through the different waivers that they had. So working with some kids as young as 4 or 5, working with some clients who are about my age, kind of experimenting, working with different populations and age ranges and so on. After my third student teaching placement as a special education major, I knew the K-12 environment was not for me. I felt like I was just shoving math and reading down these kids' throats. They didn't particularly want to be there. I didn't particularly want to be there. So I was like, okay, what's a different environment where I can work with this population and add value in a different setting, different curriculum, that type of a situation. So working with my advisor, I heard about vocational rehabilitation counseling. And for those who don't know, vocational rehabilitation counseling is essentially the science of how to help people with disabilities get a job and keep a job. So it was invented like after the First and Second World War, when we had this cohort of soldiers with traumatic brain injuries and hearing loss and vision loss and amputees and so on returning. And, we just said collectively, based on our value system, like, these folks just fought in 2 world wars. We owe them the services to help them transition and live fruitful lives. I mean, you're 18, 20, 25 years old and you're returning home with this newly acquired disability. Having services to help you, transition and utilize your skills in the workforce is a service that we all recognize was needed. That model has since been applied to different populations. Again, neurodivergent folks with intellectual disabilities, blind and low vision populations, and so on. And yeah, was a very exciting opportunity for me. So I ended up moving to Colorado to get my master's degrees in vocational rehabilitation counseling and launched my career out there with the government system. So the Colorado Division of Vocational Rehabilitation. Had a mostly neurodivergent caseload during internship, and then actually had a blind and low vision caseload for a couple of years in the Denver area. So that was a crash course and learned a lot, had some really good experiences. Again, working for the government had its moments, but it wasn't sustainable for me long term. So I was actually part of that like early wave of the Great Resignation, like July 2020. I was in Colorado during the beginning of the pandemic, and there was like a foot of snow on the ground and everything is shut down. I'm like, I need to get out of here. Yeah, right. Again, having been from Wisconsin and then living in Colorado, I was like, if I don't ever see another snowflake again, it won't be too soon. So ended up getting a job at the University of Alabama in Tuscaloosa in their Office of Disability Services. I wanted to see if the grass was greener in higher ed, so to speak. So I had a caseload of about 500 students at the University of Alabama in their Office of Disability Services, and I was facilitating their academic accommodations. Again, that had its moments, but I ended up becoming a father at that time and commuting from Birmingham to Tuscaloosa with a 6-month-old when I'm barely sleeping. And I was in a PhD program at the time as well. I was burning out fast. So I was like, let me see if there's an opportunity out here that could be a little bit more lucrative and, where I'd have that work from home flexibility so that I can really show up how I want to show up as a father, right? So I ended up at the same time, let me back up and just say, I had heard about this neurodiversity at work movement and this growing ecosystem of companies who were investing heavily in neurodiversity hiring and support initiatives. And it had created this ecosystem of different solution providers in that space as well to help them source and sustain those programs, right? So I ended up getting hired on by a small tech company that had built the Neurodiversity Career Connector on behalf of Microsoft and this cohort of companies called the Neurodiversity at Work Employer Roundtable. So that's what I was doing for about a year, was working on that concierge team for the Career Connector, supporting that talent pool of a couple thousand neurodivergent folks who were looking for jobs, as well as those companies and their talent acquisition or other program reps who were sourcing talent through that platform. Ended up getting laid off at the end of last year, which ended up being a blessing in disguise, because that's when I met Dr. Matt. I threw a open to work post out there on LinkedIn, and he replied to me and said, hey, I might have opportunity for you. So yeah, I ended up joining the Neurodiversity Collective at that time as a career coach and accommodations consultant. So working with folks, as young as high school, and my oldest client right now is in his mid-50s. So wherever you're at as a neurodivergent employee or business person or student or someone navigating those career transitions, helping them identify what is their next step and how you're going to take that next step, right? So I do that on the side with Dr. Matt right now in the Neurodiversity Collective. I also ended up getting connected with Joseph Riddle and Neurodiversity in the Workplace. So they were really at the genesis of that neurodiversity at work movement. So they've been in the space since 2013 and have really shaped what that space has looked like from a solution provider perspective, and worked with some of the most comprehensive neurodiversity at work programs in existence with companies like Dell and CVS and many others. So that's what I do during the day, is consulting with those companies to launch, scale, and sustain those neurodiversity hiring and support programs. So yeah, let me just pause there and see what threads you want to pull on a little bit further.
I mean, there's like, that's a whole like Persian rug full of threads there, man. Yeah, and this is a weird place to start, but on Monday I was in Eau Claire, Wisconsin.
Got you.
I drove by UW Eau Claire because they put me up in a hotel there because I was doing a talk for Western Dairyland Head Start, and the place that I was actually doing the talk was in Arcadia, Wisconsin.
Hmm.
And fun fact about Arcadia, Wisconsin, and I think Charles, you'll probably know this, there are no hotels in that town. So they were like, Eau Claire is the only place you can stay within an hour of this place. So I got to drive through rural Western Wisconsin. I got stuck behind a tractor. It was a thing that happened. So you've had this in the business sector, in higher education, in community mental health. You saw this, what this looks like in multiple systems. So let me ask you this, Charles, as a professional, what do you think is the optimal role for people who have your job serving the neurodivergent community in these systems? Like where are your skills best used?
Ask me that a different way.
Okay. What part of your job do you think you're most effective at?
Got you. Yeah, I think one red thread throughout that career, whether it's been in K-12 or higher ed or the government or the tech and now the nonprofit space and so on, I think one red thread is it almost feels like a translator or interpreter, right? Like there's this whole the technical term is like the double empathy problem, right? Where like there's this misconception around about a lot of neurodivergent folks that they don't communicate very well or have a quote unquote deficit in that area, right? But oftentimes when they're communicating amongst themselves, that communication is extremely fruitful, right? It's when you have people with different neurotypes who are trying to get on the same page, that can be difficult, and especially in a corporate setting a lot of times. So I think where my skills are best utilized is doing that translating for those different parties. So saying, okay, from a neurotypical hidden curriculum workplace perspective, these are the expectations of the system that you're walking into as a neurodivergent job seeker, employee, candidate, etc. And as a potentially neurotypical manager, these are the different strengths and support needs of your neurodivergent teammates and how you can leverage and apply those for that whole business case, right? So yeah, just I don't, evangelist sounds a little bit strong, but yeah, like getting people up to speed in terms of like what neurodiversity looks like in a corporate setting and how those different parties can, be on the same page and in sync. I feel like that's where the practitioners in this space are really delivering value.
Well, I mean, if you're going to be an evangelist, you're on the right podcast, right? We are here for that. Oh man, your passion comes through so much, and yeah, I love the double empathy problem. It's something I talk about a lot as well, and that really just serving as that translator, helping people with very different brains be able to communicate and share spaces. What do you think, Charles, is the biggest barrier in the way of that right now? Like what's the biggest challenge for you in your day-to-day job?
I think the different misconceptions and the different buckets that people put neurodiversity in, right? Like for example, I think in my current role with neurodiversity in the workplace, we're dealing with a talent pool that is highly capable, very minimal support needs. It's really these like light touch, low to no cost solutions that go a long way for them, right? But I think people have these other models that have been developed in terms of like a supported employment model where folks may need a lot of support needs and we may need to carve out a position for them, and it's going to take a lot of deliberate effort and somewhat reinventing the wheel from the employer's perspective. I think those thoughts are conjured to mind when we are initiating these partnerships and conversations with them. So like, what is it going to look like? How is your model different from these other models in the space? And like it's a lot. Like the space has again evolved so rapidly in the last decade that people who aren't in it as practitioners every day, understandably aren't always on the same page in terms of what that's going to look like and what's going to be required for them and what the value proposition is going to be on the back end, right? So yeah, I think that is one thing. And then I was going to say something else, but it escaped me.
Well, and this is a couple of times you've mentioned money, right? You're like a more lucrative career, like at the bottom line. Now, mental health professionals, as a rule, are terrible about talking about money. And I think we should absolutely not be afraid to talk about money. So, Charles, tell me, if I'm a business guy listening to this podcast, in my palatial mansion smoking my cigar, I'm like, oh, this young kid, he's got some good ideas. What's the bottom line return on investing in neurodivergent talent? Like, what does that show up like?
There's a variety of different elements, and it's almost like no matter what your priority and pain point is as a business, I would argue that neuroinclusion is the answer. So there's a lot of employers in the U.S. I think there was one of our partners put out a statistic, Bank of America, in terms of like 70% of employers are finding talent hard to reach, particularly in given roles right now. So it's like, on one hand, employers are over here saying we can't find the talent, particularly in these specific roles, and where we're going to find these people. They're really reaching hard. And on the other hand, we have this neurodivergent talent pool that is highly capable, grossly unemployed and underemployed. And I'm like, okay, it just seems so intuitive to connect those two dots from a talent acquisition perspective. And I think once you like peel the onion back one layer on top of that, you find that the feedback that neurodivergent folks are giving isn't just good for neurodivergent folks, it's good for everybody, right? So we talk about this in terms of the curb cut effect. So like back in the 20th century, when we were talking about physical accessibility and doing things like curb cuts for wheelchair users, we found like, okay, it's not just appreciated by wheelchair users. Like I, as a parent who's pushing a stroller, or a traveler who's carrying luggage, or someone who's on a skateboard or a bicycle rider, all these different groups also appreciated curb cuts, right? And we see that same phenomenon in a 21st century, more digital age perspective and in the world of work, right? So for example, one thing that we always talk about is skill-based and project-based hiring, rather than that traditional behavioral interview that is predicated on rapport and shared identities and, oh, you went to the same college that I did, I'm going to hire you, right? That kind of a thing. And when you do the skill-based hiring, we find that it's not only more inclusive, it's also more predictive, because it just gives you a lot better information. And it's just flat out a better way to hire. And we've seen how many other groups similar to that curb cut effect benefit have appreciated skill-based hiring. Like, for example, in one of the hiring programs we did, we had a candidate who was from Taiwan, and when she was presenting her project, the talent was undeniable. Like she had really responded to the prompts effectively. It was a like data analyst role, and like her the way that she had visualized the data was just superior to everybody else who was in that hiring event, right? But when it got to the Q&A at the end, it wasn't quite as fruitful, and it was a little clunky, and there was some misunderstandings, and it was like, wow, when we were really sticking within the parameters of this skill-based project, she was thriving and shining. And then as soon as we like kind of went back to that more behavioral Q&A thing, there was like a stark departure from that. So yeah, I think we're really in the infancy of understanding how neurodiversity affirming design is appreciated by different audiences. But for practitioners in the space who have observed it happen over and over in different settings, we know that there's something to that, and are actively working to have that data and tell that story.
Wow. I mean, this is both something we can include in the podcast, and also it's just for our process that whatever the problem, neurodiversity hiring is the answer. I was like, dude, slap that on a billboard, right? I mean, that was such a good answer. Okay, I've been talking a lot. Jake, you want to take the next question?
Yeah, I just had a question real quick because you were talking about like solutions that businesses and hiring can do. What kind of examples do you have for like low to no cost solutions that you're mentioning?
Sure. So yeah, from that talent acquisition perspective, yeah, I mean, it doesn't cost you anything to do skill-based hiring, right? So I think that is a huge one that's very much so appreciated. There's some real nuanced things, again, in that talent acquisition process, like to the way that we write job descriptions. Like a lot of autistic candidates may interpret those job descriptions in very, very concrete terms. So if you say, these skills are required. And like from the company's perspective, you're like, if you have 75% of these, we'll still consider you and still bring you in for an interview. But if like you're reading that concretely and it says required and you're like, oh, I have 90% of these things, not 100, I'm going to self-select out. Well, that could have been a viable opportunity for both parties that was missed. And, let's say you're a dyslexic person reading a job description, you just have these walls of text that you're trying to interpret, right? Versus what we would refer to as like writing in an F-shaped pattern, where you're using bullet points, you're breaking up those blocks of text, and you can just track it with much more fluency and better comprehension. So it seems like little things end up being big things in terms of ensuring that those different parties that have win-win opportunities get connected. So yeah, you probably have to write a book to really unpack like what it looks like all the way through the process, because what we can get into team dynamics and leadership style and how we design events and how we deliver different solutions to that 20% of our customers who are neurodivergent, and how those folks are voting with their wallets for companies who are really embracing neuroinclusion. So I'll pause there for now, but it's been really exciting to see the evolution of that conversation in recent years.
That's awesome, and it sounds like you're going to be writing a book soon, I take it.
I'm going to pick Dr. Matt's brain. It sounds like it's taking a couple of years off of his life with working with all these editors and the multiple efforts there. So I'm gonna proceed with caution, but thinking about it.
That's fair. I hope you do.
But yes, it's really hard to do.
Sounds like it.
I'll put you in touch with my publisher, just not my editor. So, all right. Now, Charles, let me ask you this. If you got that book written, right, and you're on CNN and they're like, well, Charles, what's one thing you'd change about the workplace? What would it be?
Right. Yeah, I think this is easier said than done, but having folks just default to empathy and flexibility, I think that is definitely something that we're trying to get across. And again, like when you go back to that double empathy problem, I think the average person in the world of work right now who is leading and managing neurodiverse teams may just reflexively be blaming their neurodivergent team members or reflexively finding them difficult to work with without really going through that level of analysis of like, okay, how am I setting the stage as a leader? Like, am I setting the stage for different use cases and different neurotypes to participate well within this team? And when something doesn't go well, how do I take ownership of that and say, okay, how is this my fault? Or how could I have a different default? Or how can I offer a suite of different solutions or ways to participate or ways to solve problems that resonate with where my team members are at? So yeah, that default is not a small thing. We're talking about hearts and minds, and it can be a difficult change effort to bring into existence. But I think that's ultimately the biggest thing and a prerequisite to these programs scaling and being sustained.
Yeah, and I agree with you, and I think that it's a really honest answer, because you've got this. We can slap a lot of systems at it. We can throw a lot of terms on it. But at the end of the day, it really is about empathy, right? It's about flexibility. It's about meeting people where they are. And that's why I think your role is so important, right? Because you are one of those people who can serve as that change agent, not just for your clients, getting them jobs, but also modeling for these businesses, these HR people, like, hey, here's the humanity of the people you're hiring. Like, it's a skill set, and with a few small tweaks, you can make this much more accommodating for this person, and your whole business benefits for it and from it. So yeah, I think it's vital work you're doing. Jake, you want to take the next question?
I was wondering, while you were talking about everything you were just saying with empathy, flexibility, and like leaders, what do you think? Not what do you think, but like, how do you gauge what a good leader in a business would be?
Good leader. So to me, it's understanding your team on that individualized level, right? So not treating everybody who joins that team as the newest cog in the machine, right? But understanding what their motivations are for being on your team, what their strengths are, what their support needs are, and how to get the most out of them. Yeah, I think that what we find with a lot of our partners is just having those questions and being very deliberate about that, like especially during those critical like onboarding and transition periods, and sitting down and being deliberate about that conversation. Like, how can I support you? How can I communicate most effectively with you? What is, your style here? Do you have any support needs that we need to address? And not even sending them like just saying, oh, they said the magic word, I'm going to send them to the accommodations team, but saying, how can, from a best practice or informal adjustment perspective, how can we again set the stage for you to do well? So yeah, I think that is really a key piece, is being responsive to that wide variety of different personas and use cases that you're going to interact with as a leader, and your, again, flexibility to be able to engage effectively and collaborate effectively with them is a big thing for me.
I would absolutely agree with that.
And to dovetail off that question, do you think neurodivergent people make good leaders?
Of course. Yeah. And this is something that comes up all the time. Like, we'll be working with a company and we'll be like, okay, we're thinking about hiring for XYZ position. Do you think neurodivergent people can do that? And in the back of my mind, I'm always thinking, we're talking about over 1 billion people here. So I think any generalization that you're going to make about this population is just fundamentally flawed, given the volume of folks that we're talking about, and just the variety of different neurotypes that we're talking about, right? So yes, there are neurodivergent people currently in leadership positions. We see companies like some of them have folks who are openly neurodivergent in the C-level. Some of the most successful entrepreneurs on earth are neurodivergent folks, and it almost sounds silly to me, like at this point, to respond to it, just given the overwhelming amount of evidence in the space. So yes, absolutely.
And because I see a lot of leadership in you. I mean, I see it not only as someone who gets to work with you, but also just in the other spaces you're in. I mean, you were at that, that
Disability In Conference.
Thank you. I was like, it was in something, right? And just everybody I talked to there said like that you just are a leader. People just look to you. And so my question here, and you get to brag about yourself a little bit now. What's your superpower? What's the thing that makes you good at what you do?
Superpower. I would say enthusiasm is a big one. I think it's a famous like Ralph Waldo Emerson quote about nothing great can be accomplished without enthusiasm. I think that's so true. I think no matter what space you're in, what role you're in, whether you're at that entry level position or you're at the very top of the organization, if you don't have that, the people around you are going to feel it, right? So yeah, I think regardless of what you're trying to do, like just being deliberate about bringing that energy consistently, and like having your self-care routine be on point so that you can show up like that all the time, like really organically, it's big.
Charles, can you talk about advice you would give to neurodivergent people about how to advocate for themselves in the workplace?
Sure. Yeah, I think this is one of those where there's not that one size fits all silver bullet solution, like I wish there was, and many people wish there was. I think it's such a personal choice. And I think the option that's been put on a pedestal is being proudly and openly neurodivergent and being that pit bull self-advocate, right? And I think that feels authentic to a lot of folks, and a lot of people have been very effective with that type of approach. I've also worked with folks, like the very first person I worked with the Neurodiversity Collective, like he said flat out to me, like, I'm late diagnosed. By the time I realized I was neurodivergent, I had all these other identities that were really like my cornerstone identities. And this is more of like an ancillary secondary identity for me. And I don't want to be proudly and openly neurodivergent in the workplace. Like he was like, after I was recognized, I like connected with all these people on LinkedIn and everything, and saw how, it's like masking is bad and that kind of thing. But he's like, for me, the goal is to mask right now. That's where I'm at with it. So I try to be respectful of those different choices that people are making, and take more of a utilitarian approach, if that makes sense, rather like not saying that identity-based conversation isn't important. Of course it is. In my role, I try to more so unpack like, okay, if you're going to advocate, to what end? What are you trying to achieve? And then based on that objective, what is going to be the pathway or approach with the highest probability of success? So it's one thing if you have a goal related to your relationship with coworkers, and it's another thing if you have a goal, related to your self-care and well-being and how work is impacting that. So let's say what is the goal here, and then let's kind of reverse engineer how to work towards that goal based on what you're trying to achieve. So I'm more unemotional and kind of concrete and pragmatic when it comes to that self-advocacy piece.
Sometimes neurodivergent people need that, though.
Absolutely.
Definitely speak from experience.
No, it just reminds me of something my mentor always used to say is that, if your solution to the problem is if everybody would just ... then you don't have a solution, because no one is ever going to just ... right? So yeah, you need that pragmatism. And really, I want to highlight a particular thing you said, Charles, because I think it's related to what we're talking about now. Is there's so much energy right now online and in the neurodivergent community about out and proud, right? You don't need to mask anymore. You be your twerky self and do all the things. I'm going to say that again. Be your quirky self and do all the things, because I definitely said twerky, and we're not in the first place. Not even you, Jake. But that kind of top-down thinking, I think, jams a lot of people into roles of advocacy and revolution that they may not want to do. I mean, if you can get a job that pays you well and you don't have to fly your neurodivergent flag, and you don't want to fly that flag, I absolutely think there's a role for that. And I think it's great that you can see that and honor that in somebody's journey, because not everybody needs to be out and proud. We obviously want them to be able to, if and when they become ready, but I think there's room for both of that. So thank you for saying that. That was really cool.
Yeah, appreciate it. No, and yeah, to piggyback on your point, yeah, I think that's exactly right in terms of like what a vision for a neuro-inclusive future of work looks like. Like, yeah, if you do choose to be out and proud and disclose and wear that neurodivergent identity on your sleeve and be unapologetic about addressing your support needs and so on, we want you to be able to do that. And if you want to take the approach of it's nobody's damn business if I'm neurodivergent or not, and that should be okay too, right? So yeah, appreciate that point.
How do you go about navigating that, like for clients, for individuals, and for like business people, like employers? Just like different conversations that you'll have with people. So like if you have a client who's like, I don't want to let all of my employers know, or you have one that's like, I'm okay with like some of my coworkers knowing. You have somewhere it's like, yeah, I want to tell everybody. And then you might have like employers who also are the same kind of mentality with it. Like, how do you navigate that?
Got you. Understood. So yeah, I think it's you have to take a whole person approach, and B, understand again what they're trying to achieve. So with that whole person approach, like a lot of Gen Zers are coming to the workplace and they're like, I've been proudly and openly neurodivergent my whole life, and like they've been in a generation where the probability of being recognized, in a U.S. context, is much higher than like early millennials and Gen X and baby boomers, right? So it's a totally different approach from that identity perspective of what they value and how to navigate that conversation. Now, I would say if somebody is taking that less identity-based perspective and a more utilitarian perspective, and they're like, I have a problem, how might disclosure play a role in being the solution to that problem? I think that's where you have to unpack, again, what are you trying to achieve? Do you have an unaddressed support need that's more of a, like the corresponding solution could be an accommodation? It's like, okay, if you don't want to tell your manager and all your teammates and you want to have a more discreet process for getting that support, there is a channel that you can do that through the reasonable accommodations process. Now, if you are like, okay, I'm having tension with my teammates and I feel like if I could just be really open about this, maybe I would have a higher probability of getting that empathy and flexibility that I'm craving. Maybe that's a different approach in terms of having those conversations with your managers or teammates if you feel like that psychological safety is present, right? So yeah, I think it's a very nuanced conversation, and it's can be difficult, particularly like I meet with a lot of folks who are like, yeah, I just got recognized as neurodivergent 2 weeks ago, and I'm trying to figure all this out. It's a lot to figure out, and yeah, again, without that clear one size fits all silver bullet solution, at the end of the day, it's going to be a personal choice. And I think a big part of our role is just helping that be an informed choice.
That's fantastic. And like it almost sounds like, if I could synthesize kind of like everything you've been saying, is that the words come up pretty frequently, but like empathy first across the board, it would be the most helpful thing for everybody, really.
Definitely, yeah. The awareness and the acceptance that leads to empathy. Yeah, that's what really sets the stage for all the other pieces and best practices and support systems that we want to see for those to fall into place. So absolutely.
Sitting here and thinking about my own journey, right, and being identified and gifted in second grade, and how that was before we knew giftedness was part of neurodivergence, right? And then being diagnosed with ADHD in high school, and having that only be a thing you could talk about in this sort of like self-effacing, like, oh, there's my ADHD, right? Don't be mean to me. My brain is weird. And now you see, talking about the generational stuff, like the kids I talk to now are like, oh yeah, I'm ADHD and dyslexic, and sometimes I dissociate. I'm like, that's so front and center now. And you probably see this more than I do, Charles, so I'd be interested in your thoughts on it. How much friction is there between the decision makers, who tend to be the older generation, and the modern people coming into these spaces where, like, I'm gluten-free vegan, and I also am neurodivergent and also LGBTQ, and by the way, you have to accommodate all my needs. Go. Like, where I would guess there's a lot of friction there.
Sure. Yeah. And that's definitely a hot topic in the space right now, as the Gen Z workforce continues to matriculate more and more into the world of work, right? Having employers who are responsive to the fact of, this is how I'm going to show up. And if it's not okay for me to show up like this as a neurodivergent employee, then I'm going to go do business with somebody else. Like, I'm not going to work here. And they're really expressing those values in a hard line kind of fashion, right? So yeah, like my question to some of those companies who are reluctant to get on the path towards being more neuro-inclusive is, if your competitors do and you don't, like, what is that going to look like? And I think that we're approaching a tipping point in the movement where, like, these companies have these strong neurodiversity brands and are getting more and more mature in their programs and what their initiatives look like. And I think I kind of anticipate seeing this exodus of talent from those less inclusive companies to those more neuro-inclusive companies, right? Kind of back to that business case conversation. Like, sure, you can have a conversation about whether you like it or not, but I think at the end of the day, when you look at it from a business case and the value proposition, the being responsive to what is being conveyed as a must-have by many Gen Zers is ultimately going to be critical for the future trajectory of your human capital strategy.
I mean, it really feels like there's this idea where across all things we've talked about, it's adapt or die, right? I mean, if your competitors are hiring neurodivergent talent and getting those outside the box thinkers and getting talent into different spaces, and you're stuck in those old paradigms where it's like, oh, well, yes, I did go to the same prep school as you, then yeah, the world is evolving rapidly. And I think our job is to position not only our clients to ride that wave, but also make sure the places they're landing are capable to receive them. And I think that's what makes our work so important. So that's really cool.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a question I get all the time from the career coaching clients, is like, okay, so having a neuro-inclusive company is important to me. How do I discern that as a candidate who's in this hiring pipeline, right? Like, so I'm applying for a job, I'm looking up the employer, like, what are the red flags and the green flags, so to speak? and having a different process in mind to be able to somewhat audit these companies and try to think about on the front end what that's going to look like what is, again, the probability of you having a neuro-inclusive experience. So yeah, it's not always obvious because like there are definitely players in this space who want the reputational capital and they have some great marketing agendas, but the substance behind the program and the experience of neurodivergent candidates once they're actually in that space is not always congruent with the message that they were being fed on the front end as a candidate. So it can be definitely a difficult terrain to navigate, and something that we definitely have conversations about with our clients at the Neurodiversity Collective for sure.
And I got to ask then, what is your biggest green flag? Because I love that language, right? I love it. What's the biggest green flag for a company who is actually walking the walk when they're talking about neuro-inclusivity, not just talking the talk?
Sure. Yeah, I think it's hard to hang your hat on any one variable or data point, but to me, some of the companies who are the most mature neuro-inclusive companies are, again, going from that phase of having like a pilot or lighthouse program, so to speak, where it's kind of like, okay, this little side project that we're doing over here, and they are actually adopting some of these best practices in those mainstream elements of their talent acquisition and team building and other processes, right? So yeah, anything that you can pick up, like, oh, okay, these people actually see that neurodiversity is good for everyone, not just neurodivergent folks, and they're adopting some of those best practices, that's a big one. Another one I would probably say is the leadership and managers. Like there are a lot of companies who have found some neurodivergent entry-level talent, but some of the more mature programs have, again, those C-level executives, those managers, and they're really deliberate about cultivating their neurodivergent talents and making sure that they're able to progress and matriculate to those upper echelons of the company as well, or that door is at least open. So yeah, there's a few different data points that you can look at, but those are probably two of the big ones.
I like that. So there's a maturity aspect of it. You have to sort of build that cred and build those best practices. But if I'm hearing you correctly, starting that journey with the best of ideas and informed practices means you're much more likely to mature into that space that can support people.
Absolutely. Yeah. And in terms of that starting point, like the starting point most of the time is someone asks me what I do, and I say I'm a neurodiversity practitioner, and they say, what the heck is neurodiversity? Right. So understanding that that's the starting point is pre-awareness, like going in there and being able to have the conversations about like, okay, here's a overview of neurodiversity training and Q&A, and then like, okay, here's some different resources that are contextualized to your role as the manager and your role as the HR talent acquisition professional, or your role as the leader, and so on. Yeah, that's where you have to start, and there can be a long runway, again, just making sure that awareness and acceptance is in place before you can even get to that level of wanting to optimize and scale and sustain. So yeah, it's a journey for any company, understandably, right? And yeah, when we're talking about organizational change, no matter what direction you're trying to go with that organizational change, it's going to be a journey. So yeah, that's what I would add.
So I think we've had an amazing conversation today, and I could definitely still fill some more hours with you, but let's try and keep our podcast length to a neurodivergent friendly length. They'll all be listening to this at 1.5 times speed anyway. So I'm going to start to sound like Alvin from the Chipmunks. But Charles, I have a very important question for you, and I really want you to dig deep for this one. If you could have any superhero from any comic book universe on speed dial, who would you pick and why?
Who would I pick and why?
Hard-hitting questions.
That is a hard-hitting one.
Very important too.
Yeah. I had a bit of a like Iron Man nickname in high school because I had a face surgery and some titanium templates put into my cheekbone right here. So I'm probably going to say Iron Man. Yeah, I think he could definitely come in a pinch in terms of letting me borrow Jarvis or letting me use a lot of his tech stack. So yeah, I think the value proposition of Iron Man is pretty strong.
I'm here for that. All right, that was my final question. Jake, you want to give them yours?
One of my favorite questions to ask people is, what's your favorite word and why?
I don't know if I have a favorite word. I think it's the combination that makes them interesting, right? Like I definitely understand like some words just sound good to people. I don't think that they land on my ear like that necessarily. So yeah, given that it's football season, again, I'm from Wisconsin where we're obsessed because it's frozen half the year and all we have to do is watch sports. I'm probably going to say touchdown.
Fair.
Right now, I think it's touchdown.
Absolutely fair.
And he showed his work. He's like, here's why. For a second, I thought he was going to go like full like Latin root there, but no, context matters, right? On Wisconsin, indeed. All right. Well, that feels like a nice note to end this podcast on. So before Jake and I say our goodbyes, Charles, is there anything you'd like to leave our listeners with?
Yeah, just thank you all for tuning in and your interest in neurodiversity. If you are a neurodivergent job seeker, please sign up for the Neurodiversity in the Workplace Talent Pool at nitw.org, or reach out to the Neurodiversity Collective. Yeah, that's it.
Well, yeah, you have a lot to offer the community, and you're already doing such amazing work. So it's so cool to amplify that. So, all right, Jake, what are your final thoughts?
My final thoughts is that it's just been fantastic getting to know you more as a coworker, but also as a person. And you're doing some awesome stuff. I didn't even know about half of it. So part of it for me is also just the joy of getting to know more of what people do. So thank you for all of that.
Yeah, appreciate it. Likewise.
It's almost like that's why we set up this podcast.
What?
References. Yeah. Well, it is truly a pleasure to be a part of this team and to get everybody together. So for those of you out there listening, I'm Dr. Matt Zakreski. This is Nerding Out on Neurodiversity. Thank you so much for being here with us today. Please come back and like, follow, subscribe, do all those fancy clicky things you do on the interwebs, and we will see you again next time. Thanks so much for coming. Nerding Out on Neurodiversity is brought to you by Dr. Matt Zakreski and the team at the Neurodiversity Collective. To learn more about the Neurodiversity Collective or to be a guest on the podcast, please visit our website at www.theneurodiversitycollective.com/podcast. Audio and production by Jake Noonan. Show your support by subscribing, leaving a 5-star review, and telling your friends about us. Our Instagram and social media handles are at #NoonPodcast, NOON podcast. Your support is appreciated and keeps us going. All discussions presented on this podcast are strictly for informational purposes, awareness, and understanding. The advice presented is not and should not be considered to be therapeutic in nature. If you have any mental health questions, please contact your provider. All rights reserved.